Welcome to the 13th CEPREAERE webinar on climate policy. It's my pleasure to organize this event today. It's a special event. The recent webinars were mostly on the roundtable with different speakers. This time we have only one speaker. But I've been aware recently of an effort by Adrien Fabre to a proposal for global climate. I think economists have not been very good over the last 2 decades to try to resolve the problem of international negotiation for climate change. Of course, climate change and emissions of CO2 generate a global externality, and we don't have a simple resolution of this problem, which raises many different issues in terms of efficiency of the allocation of efforts globally, but also a deep problem related to international redistribution of incomes. So today we have Adrien Fabre, who will make a proposal to resolve those problems. Adrien is a researcher at CNRS in France. He has an office at CIRED, close by from downtown Paris. Yeah, I'm very glad to see a young researcher combining deep research in the domain and also making policy proposals. It's quite unusual and quite impressive, by the way. So, Adrien, the floor is yours. You have 60 minutes for presentation, and that will leave 30 minutes for discussion. Dear participants, you can raise your question in the chat, but you will also have the possibility to express your view live at the end of this presentation. So be prepared to raise your question. Adrien, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian, for the introduction. I'm very glad to present you today a global plan to fight climate change and extreme poverty. So, as you said, it's a bit unusual for a presentation because in the first part, I will present academic research, and in the second part, I will present an academic proposal. So let me start with the research, or with the introduction. Climate change is a global problem that requires global solution. Lower income countries lack the capacity to tackle climate change, and without global coordination, countries also lack incentive to decarbonize. Some are doing it on their own, but some don't, or do not enough. Moreover, many people ponder over the lack of fairness of the current regime, and actually many low-income countries condition their decarbonization efforts on payment from high-income countries. A fair and global climate plan can address these issues. I will present it in a minute, but before, let me say that we tested this plan among the population of 20 countries, and it garnered majority support in every of them. So how can we meet the universally agreed targets to stay below 2 degrees of global warming? How can we guarantee an emissions trajectory in line with our carbon budget? Well, a robust way to secure an emissions trajectory in line with the target is a yearly cap on global carbon emission, or a global carbon price that would function in the same way. As most of you are economists, you know that the most efficient way to address, to price carbon is with tradable permits rather than non-tradable, and that we should auction these permits to polluting firms rather than give it to them freely. And we should do it the most upstream possible. So we should regulate firms that are importing fossil fuels or extracting them rather than someone filling the tank of their cars. it's more practical. So with an emissions trading system in place at the global scale, the question is how to allocate the global carbon pricing revenues. Here, there is one simple focal point, an equal cash transfers for every adult in the world. We estimate that such a global basic income would be around $30 to $50 per month, which would be enough to alleviate extreme poverty, defined as someone living with less than $2 a day. Moreover, the global climate scheme that has just been outlined garners majority support in the 20 countries that we have surveyed. So let's show the support for this global climate scheme. We've done several surveys with different co-authors. The first survey is the global one on 20 countries with 2,000 respondents per country. And in the paper by De Chellepret and co-authors with Blueberry Plantreau, Stephanie Sancheva, Tobias Cruz, and Ana Sanchez-Chico, we focus on attitudes toward climate change and national policies. And the questions of this survey about global policies are presented in the new paper by myself, to Adrien and Linus Mattard, which has just been released as a working paper. In that paper, we also run complementary surveys in the US and in 4 European countries that you see in yellow on the map, to study in further detail the attitudes toward global policies. Let me say here that all of our surveys are very representative of the population, at least in high-income countries. In middle-income countries, it's mostly representative of the online population. So it's, young, educated, and urban people are overrepresented. But in high-income countries, the quota method ensures that the population frequency are closely matched in our sample. And we use the standard technique to make the survey data of highest quality possible. The survey have been conducted online with specialized survey companies. So let me give the results of the global surveys. So on this heat map, let's look first at the level at which policies are needed. So we ask respondents to choose as many boxes as they wished for the appropriate level of climate policies. 85% of them choose the global level, and only half of them choose the national or European level, and even less choose a more local level. So the willingness to have global policies, climate policies at the global level, is confirmed when we tested global climate policies. The support for global climate policies is in general as strong as the support for the national policies that are the most supported. So let's look at these specific policies. And just a precision, we ask the questions on a 5 Likert scale, ranging from strongly opposed to strongly support. And in this heat map, I present the relative support. So the share of support answer among non-indifferent. So the first policy tested is a global emissions trading system. And it receives generally more than 80% of relative support and an absolute majority support in every country. We don't specify in that question how we would allocate the emissions right or among the countries, what we call country shares. We do this in a subsequent question, and we find a consensus in favor of allocating emission shares in proportion to the country's population, which amounts to giving an equal right to emit to each human. The least preferred option everywhere is grandfathering, meaning to allocate emission share in proportion to the country's current emission. Intermediate support is found for more redistributive policies than the equal per capita, the one that takes into account historical responsibilities of country, or the one that gives more right to emit to countries that are more vulnerable to the consequences of climate change. Other global policies are supported by more than 80% of the respondents, like a global tax on millionaires that would finance low-income countries compliant with climate targets, or a global assembly elected on a global list whose role would be to draft international treaties to tackle climate change. Interestingly, you see that a global tax on greenhouse gas that would finance a global basic income is less supported, with around 50% of support in high-income countries, and in middle-income countries, the support is as strong as for the emissions trading system divided in equal per capita terms. But the economic consequences of these two policies are the same. So why is there such a difference in the level of support? There are two reasons. First, people may prefer a quota than a tax, because with the tax, they are not sure that we will meet the 2-degree target. Whereas for a cap on global emission, it's clear that we would. Second is the framing. When we presented the emissions trading system, we didn't explain the distributive effect. And when we presented this one, we made salient the distributive effect. So people in high-income countries learned that the typical people in their country would lose out financially from the policy. So we were amazed at this stage by the strong support for global policies. Especially, you can see it on the top of the graph. And at the same time, appearance of global policies are rare in political debate. And we wanted to understand this mismatch between a rare appearance in political debate and a strong stated support. We had several hypotheses. One was that the support was not sincere, and I will present other hypotheses down the line. So to test these hypotheses, assess whether the support was robust, we launched new surveys. And in these surveys, we mostly focus on the global climate scheme. The global climate scheme combined the last two global carbon pricing policies that I've just described. It's a global emissions trading system, not a tax, funding a global basic income, and we specified to the respondent the incidence on the typical people of their country. So here is the description that we present to the respondent. We tell them that to contain global warming below 2 degrees, there is a maximum amount of greenhouse gases we can emit globally. That with the cap on emissions, we would make fossil fuel company pays for their emission. This would lead to higher fossil fuel prices, which would encourage people and companies to use less fossil fuels, eventually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This would finance a global basic income of $30 per month for every adult. That would lift out of extreme poverty the 700 million people who live with less than $2 a day. We tell the respondent that their typical fellow respondent would lose out financially, $85 a month for an American, 10 euros a month for a French person, 25 euros a month for a German one. And we conclude by presenting the policy as a climate club that would enter into force as soon as 60% of global emissions are covered by signatory countries, and with possible sanctions against non-participatory countries. We don't show this to the respondent, but here is a primer on the net gains from the global climate scheme. You see, and this is in 2030. So you see that it would lead to a redistribution at the global scale from people with a carbon footprint higher than the world average to people with a carbon footprint lower than the global average. And before asking the support for the global climate scheme, we present to the respondents another policy, a national redistribution scheme. The national redistribution would tax the top incomes, the top 1% of incomes in Europe, the top 5% of incomes in the US, and use the revenues to finance an equal cash transfers to all people of the country. And this national redistribution would be calibrated to offset the loss of the median emitter from the global climate scheme. We added this policy because we hypothesized that the support for the global climate scheme would be stronger if complemented by a national redistribution scheme. To make sure that respondents understand the policies we've described, after each description, we ask a comprehension question on the most critical aspect of the policy, the distributive effect. So after the global climate scheme, we asked in an incentivized way who would win and who would lose from the policy, expecting the respondent to answer that a typical person in their country would lose, and then the poorest humans would win. Then we give them the correct answer, present them the national redistribution, ask who would win and lose from national redistribution, expecting them to answer that the richest people in their country would lose and the typical people would win, giving them the correct answer, describing them again, the two policies in a shorter way, and asking them the distributive effect of both policies combined, expecting them to answer that a typical person in their country would neither win nor lose from the two policies combined, and giving them the correct answer. After that, we describe a third policies, the national climate policies. In the US, it's coal phase out. In Europe, it's thermal insulation plan. And only after that, we ask people whether they support or not the global climate scheme, and then the national redistribution scheme, and the three policies combined. You can see here that the global climate scheme receives majority support in our simple yes no question, a slight majority in the US with 54% of support, and a strong majority in Europe with 76% of support. The support is equally strong for the national redistribution scheme and for the three policies combined. We have conducted we have asked other questions to test whether people would prefer a national distribution alone or a global climate scheme and a national redistribution combined. And as many people support the combination of the two than the global climate scheme alone, meaning that the support for the global climate scheme does not increase if complemented by a national redistribution scheme. This came to a surprise to us because we thought that people would be more supportive if they didn't lose from the policy. But these results suggest that people, those who are willing to support a global climate policy, they are also willing to lose some dozens of dollars per month if it allows limiting climate change and alleviating extreme poverty. Now, we also tested the support for other global redistributive policies. There is very strong support for the policies that are discussed at the COP, payments from high-income countries to low-income countries to either compensate the latter for the damages from climate change, for adaptation, or to finance climate mitigation. Two policies do not receive a majority support in every country: the cancellation of low-income countries' public debt and putting a cap on individual wealth. In Europe, there is majority support for capping wealth at 100 million euros for each person. And in the US, where we guessed that the support would be lower, we tested a higher amount and there isn't a majority to support a cap on wealth, even at $10 billion. A national or a global tax on millionaires are also very strongly supported, and so is a global financial register to fight tax evasion. We ask additional question on a global wealth tax. We first ask respondents to imagine that a global wealth tax is in place at the global level, and that the tax would tax wealth in excess of $5 million. To a subsample, we ask them what share of the global tax should be pooled and allocated to low-income countries. 90% of the respondents give a positive amount, and on average, respondents say that 1/3 should go to fund low-income countries' public services and infrastructure. To another subsample, we asked a variant of the question in a binary way. We asked them whether they would prefer that each country retains the revenue collected from the wealth tax and say that this would fund increased spending on education and healthcare, or that half of the global wealth tax revenues is pooled and allocated to low-income countries. And in that case, only increased spending on healthcare could be financed. Well, around half of the people prefer to allocate half of the tax revenues to low-income countries, which is consistent with the first variant, and which is a first sign that the support for global redistribution is sincere. Because here, we made the opportunity cost salient. Now, we also tested the sincerity of the support for the global climate scheme using a range of methods. The first one being a real stake petition. We asked the respondents whether they would be willing to sign a petition to one subsample about the global climate scheme, to another about national redistribution. To see, we also asked for national redistribution to see whether, to control, to see for a normal policy, whether the support would decrease in the petition format compared to the direct support. And we specified to the respondents that we will send the results of that question to the head of state office, making the petition real stake. I mean, making the question real stake, because respondents don't have to actually sign the petition. As you see, in the US, almost as many people are willing to sign this petition as they state they support the global climate scheme. It's still a majority. In Europe, the support decreases by 7 percentage points, but remains a strong majority. And the support decreases similarly for the national redistribution. So majorities are willing to sign a real stake petition. Another way we tested the sincerity is by measuring the social desirability bias. Indeed, people may be compelled to answer yes because of a social norm, even though they would secretly prefer that the global climate scheme does not take place. A way to test for a social norm is to ask an unusual question, asking among the policies below, and then we present a list of policies, how many do you support? And then we vary the list of policies for different respondents. For some respondents, we present national redistribution, a national climate policy, and let's say death penalty for major crimes. And to another subsample, we present this list plus the global climate scheme in the list. When we compare the average number of supported policies in the two subsamples, we measure the tacit support for the global climate scheme. This method has been used to test for social desirability bias among Russians in favor of the war in Ukraine. And it was found that there is 15 percentage point social desirability bias. So the tacit support is 50 percentage point lower than the stated direct support for the war in Ukraine. In our case, there is no significant difference in the tacit support from the direct support. The tacit support is 2 percentage points lower or 3 percentage points lower, which is not significant at the 20% confidence interval, 20% threshold. So we find no evidence for a social desirability bias, and if there is one, it is small. A very interesting question is this one, where we ask respondents to choose between two candidates in a hypothetical election in their country. Candidate A is a progressive candidate, candidate B is a conservative candidate, each of them with a platform that corresponds to usual progressive or conservative policies of the countries. And to 1/2 of the sample, we add to the progressive candidate platform the global climate scheme. And what we find is that when the global climate scheme is in the progressive platform, the progressive candidate never receives a lower level of support. And it even receives more vote intentions in France. A progressive candidate would gain 11 percentage points in vote intention at the second round of the French presidential election by endorsing the global climate scheme. In the US, the effect is positive at 3 percentage points, but not significant. The p-value is 13%. And in the other countries, it's not significant at all. Another way to ask the question of the electoral influence of the global climate scheme is the following. We ask respondents, we ask these questions differently in the US and in Europe. In Europe, we ask respondents to imagine that a left-wing party or left-wing coalition would win the next election, and tell them that there are two potential platforms that this party may have campaigned on. And we ask them which of the platform they would have they prefer that the party or the coalition would have campaigned on. In the US, we present the two platforms as the platform of the two frontrunners in the next Democratic primary. And we don't ask the question to Republicans, only to Democrats, independents, and non-affiliated. So, except for the global climate scheme, on average, platform A and platform B are the same because each policy of the platform is chosen randomly from a pool of progressive policies. What we find is that the platform that includes the global climate scheme is preferred by 58 to 60% of the respondents compared to the platform that doesn't. By the way, this question is also a way to address experimental demand or acquiescence bias, because here respondents had no way to understand that we were interested in the global climate scheme in their answer and not on the whole platform. We also asked a similar question. Here, the complete platform is totally random. So the global climate scheme is sometimes in platform A, sometimes in platform B, sometimes in both platforms, sometimes in none of them. And here I present the results for the UK. On this graph, you can see the effect of including a policy compared to having no policy of this domain in the platform for a platform to be preferred. So the policies that are most important to gain support, and we see that in all countries, are higher spending on public services like education or healthcare, as well as a higher minimum wage. What is interesting is that this is closely followed by global redistributive policies like a global tax on millionaires or the global climate scheme. Not increased foreign aid, by the way. Actually, the literature, there is an extensive literature on attitudes towards foreign aid, and the results are mixed. In general, people overestimate current foreign aid, and they are willing to support more foreign aid once they know the actual amount. But it's not clear-cut, especially in the US. And perhaps it is because of this focus on foreign aid that the literature so far has missed the support for global policies, because foreign aid is national policy. What we see here is that candidates would have an electoral gain by endorsing global redistributive policies. So at this stage, we have shown that the support for the global climate scheme and global redistributive policies in general is sincere. So we tested other hypotheses to explain the mismatch between a strong support and the lack of global policies in political platform or the public debate. One of these hypotheses is that of pluralistic ignorance, that a majority of people would be in favor of global redistribution, but people would think that their fellow citizens are in majority opposed to global redistribution. To test that, we asked people their perception of the support for the global climate scheme and national redistribution scheme in 2 random subsamples among their fellow citizens. And we do this in an incentivized way. In the US, perceptions are quite accurate, as the average belief is very close to the average support for both policies. In Europe, the support is underestimated by 15 percentage points for both policies, but it's not a strong evidence for pluralistic ignorance, as a majority of Europeans correctly perceive that a majority of them are in favor of the global climate scheme. So we dismissed the hypothesis of pluralistic ignorance. Another hypothesis was that people don't have a consistent view, and to test that, we asked questions uncovering broad underlying values. The best way we tested that is with an experiment. We told the respondents that they were automatically enrolled into a €100 lottery, and asked them, should they win the lottery prize, what share should be given to an association and what share they can take for themselves. 1/2 of the sample, we said that the association would channel the donation to an African living in poverty. And to another half, we said that the association would channel the money to a fellow citizen living in poverty. In the US, the donation is 2.5 percentage point higher for the poor American than for the poor African. But the difference is small, as it is entirely driven by Trump voters and non-voters, who donate 5 to 6 percentage point more to their fellow citizens. Democrats give the same to both. In Europe, we don't find significant difference. which shows that there isn't a national bias, at least for donation. If you want, I can show other results that show that, for example, global policies are given a high priority among a list of different policies, just below higher minimum wage and better public services. Results showing that most people would like that global justice is taken into account by their country's negotiators, diplomats in international negotiations. Results showing that close to half of the people and half of left-wing voters defend humans or humans and animals when they vote, not a smaller group like themselves or their fellow citizens, and that people rank global issues like climate change higher than national inequality in the importance of issues. So overall, these results on universalistic values confirm that there is a substantial part of people with universalist value, which is in line with the majority of people supporting global redistribution. So to wrap up, we've seen that across the world, people seem ready for international solidarity. There is a consensus on a global emissions trading system where the emissions permit would be allocated on an equal per capita basis. We find majority support for global policies, including when they are detrimental to one's own country. We find that the support is mostly sincere. Majorities are willing to sign a real SEC petition in favor of the global climate scheme. Progressive candidates would not lose votes by endorsing it and may even win a vote in France. And people largely prefer platforms that include the global climate scheme to platforms that do not. We cannot explain the mismatch between the strong support and the lack of global policies in the public debate, as most people show some adherence to universalism, and as we don't find evidence of pluralistic ignorance. People correctly guess the support of the public for the global climate scheme. So at this stage, we need alternative hypotheses to explain this mismatch. My favorite hypothesis at this stage is a national bias in power structure. Elections, the most important elections are at the national level. Media often target national audience, and this probably creates a bias in mental structures, and people may ignore the possibility of global policies. And even politicians may only devise policies at the national scale, forgetting the global one. Another hypothesis is that there would be pluralistic ignorance, but only of the elites, that policymakers would wrongly perceive global redistributive policies as unpopular. We are currently testing this hypothesis using a survey on members of parliament in France, Germany, and the European Parliament, and the preliminary results tend to dismiss the hypothesis. A third hypothesis is that global redistribution is an idea whose time has come, and maybe it would enter the public debate and may even be implemented with a little push with some advocacy work. And to test the latter hypothesis, I've launched with some colleagues a new association, which is entitled Global Redistribution Advocates. And this makes the transition with the second part. At Global Redistribution Advocates, we advocate for global redistributive policies supported by majorities. We've met already 30 people, and including important ones. For example, we are meeting with the cabinet of Emmanuel Macron next week. And we have written policy briefs describing each of our policies, and we've just launched petitions for each of them. So let me now describe what we propose the Global Climate Plan. The Global Climate Plan is not our idea, it's an old idea. Actually, it's perhaps even the benchmark climate policies for economists. The oldest occurrence I've found was from Michael Grubb in 1990. And then Agarwal and Narain, the year after, pushed for an even more radical version of it. Bertrand also advocated for carbon pricing at the global level with emissions rights allocated on an equal per capita basis. Let me quote Michael Grubb, who said that by far the best combination of long-term effectiveness, feasibility, equity, and simplicity is obtained from a system based upon tradable permits for carbon emission, which are allocated on an adult per capita basis. The support for this solution has been renewed ever since, for example, by Jamieson or Raghuram Rajan more recently. In a book edited by Crampton, Ackenfeld, and Stoft, all authors agreed for a climate club involving international transfers. The chapter by Christian Gollier and Jean Tirole synthesized the distributional decision of this policy with a generosity parameter, which can go from 0 to 1, with 0 corresponding to full grandfathering and 1 to the full equal per capita option. So basically, what we propose with the Global Climate Plan is to set the generosity parameter at its maximum. Crampton and his co-author rely on game strategy and on the lack of generosity of country to propose that the country with average carbon emission fix the generosity parameter. Why? Because these countries would neither win nor lose from the policy, so they just want the highest possible price of carbon. And they will set the generosity parameter strategically so that the price is highest. And the price in what they propose is chosen as the minimum price proposed by participating countries. And here participating countries are serious countries, like we exclude countries which are clearly not willing to fight climate change. We argue that we don't have to rely on a lack of generosity of country, given what I've previously presented, and that we should set the carbon price using our climate targets. And so it's our climate objective that should define our level of ambition. Vandenberg and his co-author propose a dual track towards global carbon pricing, relying on an expanding climate club, starting with countries that already implement an emissions trading system, like the European Union, integrating more countries into that, and reorienting international negotiations on the question of the distribution of efforts, the burden sharing, and on how to expand an emissions trading system to the global scale. The IMF also proposed a minimum price on carbon at the global level, with either differentiated prices among countries or a uniform price with international transfers. These are two possible solutions that the IMF sees to solve the fairness issue. The global carbon tax with dividend has already been surveyed before by Karatini, Kelbeken, and Arloff, who found results consistent with our global survey, 80% of support in India, and about half of the population supporting it in Anglo-Saxon countries. As we've seen, the support is higher when it's a quota than with a tax. So to compute the basic income, to estimate it, we start with an emissions trajectory that is compatible with the 2 degrees target. We add to that a carbon price trajectory, which is consistent with the emissions reduction thought. These two trajectories presented here are taken from the IPCC. And then the basic income is simply computed by multiplying CO2 emissions by the carbon price and dividing by the adult population above 15 years old. You see that the basic income is estimated to plateau at around $50 per month for about 30 years, and then decline as the world economy gets closer to net zero. I don't know if okay, let me insist on the principle of the global climate plan. First, there will be a global cap on emissions to meet the 2-degree target. Defined, the emissions trajectory would be defined using commonly agreed carbon budgets. And we would use emissions trading system. We are open to having carbon stacks instead of emissions trading system. Both are equally good in our mind. Let's just keep in mind that emissions trading system already covers 17% of global greenhouse gas emission. It's in place in Europe, China, Korea, California, and it's considered by many other countries, including low-income countries. Second, the global climate plan would distribute a global basic income, and the international redistribution would be massive. At its peak, the global climate plan's revenue would amount to 5% of the world GDP, and 1% of the world GDP would flow from high-income countries to low-income countries. The basic income of around $50 per month would be enough to lift out of poverty the 7 million people who live with less than $2 a day. It's $2 in purchasing parity power. So in purchasing parity power in Africa, the $50 per month of the basic income would be $100 a month and would be more than $2 a day. Third principle, it would be implemented as a climate club. It would enter into force as soon as there is enough countries participating. We take the threshold of 60% of global emission, which corresponds to the US, the EU, China, and India, but which also corresponds to countries that win from the global climate scheme, China, and the EU and the UK. So the global climate scheme could enter into force even if the US do not participate. The climate club would implement a carbon border adjustment to avoid carbon leakage and to incentivize non-participating countries to join the club. Here are the distributive effects of the global climate scheme in 2030. You may be disturbed by something here, that some middle-income countries like South Africa, Libya, Iran, or China would lose out from the policy. This may seem unfair, as populations in these countries are not rich, and beyond fairness considerations, these countries may simply not want to participate if they would lose out from the policy. And we need China in the club for it to function, as China represents 30% of global emission. Don't worry, we have devised a participation mechanism, more precisely, an opt-out provision to account for the ability to pay of country. How would it work? Well, countries that are not rich could opt out from the mutualization of revenues. And countries that have the possibility to opt out and who have, which have a carbon footprint higher than the world average would exercise this opt-out provision. In doing so, they would retain the auction revenues collected on their territory and use these revenues as they please. Full opt-out would be authorized for countries with a GDP per capita not higher, that does not exceed the global average by more than 50%. And the opt-out, the right to opt-out would linearly decrease up to twice the global average GDP per capita. So countries above twice the world average GDP per capita would not be allowed to opt out. This provision allows countries like China, Iran, or South Africa not to lose from the global climate plan. And this provision is the main difference between the global climate scheme that I presented earlier, that was presented to the respondent, and what we call now the global climate plan. There are other participation mechanisms, for example, provisions to accommodate subnational entities into the club. Here I'm thinking of US states like California. These subnational entities would be allowed to opt out from the carbon border adjustment and to use their revenues as they please. So California, for example, could still use the carbon pricing revenues to subsidize regulated firms instead of distributed basic income. This way, democratic states like California, New York, Illinois, and others could join the global climate plan, even if the federal level doesn't. And keep in mind that US states where Democrats have more than 50 percentage points of margins in the election represent 40% of the US GDP. So I agree that it would be hard to get the federal level on board because it would require the Democrats holding the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency. But we're hoping that in single states could join the club. Finally, there would be a provision to avoid anti-redistributive transfers, preventing high-income countries from winning from the policy. So in the case that is not going to happen soon, where high-income countries would have a lower than average carbon footprint, they would not be allowed to receive revenues. Here are the redistributive effects of the global climate plan in 2030, taking into account all participation mechanisms. As you can see, many countries are now in white, meaning that they would neither lose nor win from the policy. The policy would basically involve transfers from OECD countries and countries of the Arabian Peninsula to Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Here are the distributive effects aggregated throughout the century. It's the net present value using a discount rate of 4%, and it's expressed in terms of in proportion to the country's GDP. So we see that the US would lose 1 to 2% of their GDP throughout the century, and countries like the DRC would gain more than 10% of GDP, and even more in the first years, actually. The global climate plan should not be implemented in isolation. It is complementary with other policies. First, the basic income would increase the fiscal capacity of low-income countries, allowing this country to raise taxes to fund public services and infrastructures. Second, when carbon pricing revenue declined in the second half of the century, it would be a good idea to sustain the basic income. To do that, we could mobilize new sources of funding by then, such as a global minimum rate on corporate income. Something remains unaddressed in the global climate plan. It's historical responsibilities of countries. Maybe you've seen the new paper by Fanning and Hickel, which came out today, and estimated that high-income countries owe carbon debt in the range of twice the global GDP to low-income countries. I mean, they will owe that debt at the end of the decarbonization. They are still accumulating that debt by not transferring resources to low-income countries. The global climate plan would address this fairness between countries from its state of implementation, but not before. Our view is that this historical responsibility is best addressed by a global wealth tax, because wealth is probably a better proxy of having benefited from past emission than the emission of one's country. Think of Ukraine. It has emitted a lot in the past, but it is not now quite poor. It would be strange to ask this country to pay a strong carbon debt. In high-income countries, the global climate plan can be complemented with national redistribution to offset the negative incidence on median emitters. And in other words, we can leave the bulk of the financial burden on the top 5% of income. The global climate scheme would foster national climate policies instead of substitute to them. Indeed, if a country lowers its emissions, then it reduces the amount it will pay to the rest of the world from the emissions trading system. So countries have an incentive to decarbonize through other means. And not only do they have an incentive, but it's a good idea. I mean, some other climate policies are to be done, because by mutualizing some decarbonization costs, national climate policies can reduce horizontal inequalities. Think of two persons with the same level of income and very different carbon footprint. With the global climate plan alone, the person with a high carbon footprint would lose much more than the one with a low carbon footprint. If there is some solidarity within a nation, then we can mutualize the cost, for example, by subsidizing insulation work, public transport, etc., so that people who already have a low carbon footprint pay part of the cost for some who have a high carbon footprint, and we will also have to change their habits. Finally, we think that a global democratic climate assembly would be the best forum to choose the specificities of the global climate regulation and to enforce climate governance. Let me give some details on the implementation, because I've shown that there is strong support among the population, but there is some challenges in the implementation. We need to monitor, report, and verify emissions of large industrial units. And this may be a challenge in countries lacking institutional capacity. But I have to say, we have to do that for any climate policy. I mean, whatever the solution to climate change, we'll have to do that. And actually, the Global Climate Plan would provide resources and assistance from experienced countries. So it would probably facilitate this verification of emissions compared to relying on only national policies. Where the challenge is the largest is in distributing a global basic income to remote places. We need to reach every human adult, and we need to avoid fraud. We need to avoid that someone receives the basic income several times. This is challenging, but there are solutions. Most countries already maintain register of the population, like electoral lists, and already have social transfers that are effective at targeting isolated people. We can also use technology like smartphone. Smartphone can provide biometric identification and are a cheap means of transaction. And for regions that are not connected to internet, satellite internet might soon become cheap and ubiquitous, according to experts. I won't get into the details, but we have thought of details of the plan. I will conclude with a call to action. If you liked the Global Climate Scheme, you can endorse it on globalredistributionadvocates.org. We've just launched a petition. Please feel free to share our petition and the policy brief. If you want to know more about the Global Climate Plan, you can read it. And if you want to help our cause, well, we want to set up a scientific committee to discuss the specificities of the Global Climate Plan and address scientific questions. So we would welcome social scientists on board. Finally, if you have any comment or criticism, I'm happy to take any question or remark. And I will conclude with a 2-minute video by Greta Thunberg.
Being sacrificed for the opportunity, our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money. Our biosphere is being sacrificed so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury. It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few. The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there still was time to act. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done, rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis. We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to focus on equity. And if solutions within this system are so impossible to find, then maybe we should change the system itself. We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You have ignored us in the past, and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses, and we are running out of time. We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not. The real power belongs to the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrien. There are many questions, but before we go to the Q&A and see what are the main issue here, let me just make my own comment on this. What strike me from your presentation is the level of altruism of the people in the survey. That's quite impressive, and that counter my own perception on this. For example, universalism, the fact that people do not care more, do care, and let me present it positively, people care as much for the extra people for other countries as their own citizens. So that's surprising. It seems to be contradicted by the big issues in the US and in Europe about immigration and the stress about immigration. Jean Tirole and myself, in our paper that you cited, 2015, we had the idea that people were much less altruist than what you get, and therefore suggested that rather than having an explicit and quite transparent international transfer to the South, it would be better to be less transparent because of the lack of altruism, and to provide, to create a system where, for example, we distribute per capita permits, the same number of permits to any people living in this planet, implying quite of a sizable transfer. What do you think about that?
So people are very much against immigration. but it doesn't mean they are against global redistribution. It may seem surprising, but actually many people think that global redistribution can be a way to prevent immigration, I guess. And here I want to say that attitudes are different in the US and in Europe. In Europe, right-wing people and extreme right-wing people are strongly in favor of the global climate plan, but it's not the case of US Republicans. In the US, it's very polarized, with 3/4 of Democrats endorsing the plan and 3/4 of Republicans opposing it. In Europe, yeah, it seems that people are more altruistic than what we thought, and but it's not. There is some kind of reciprocity in their attitudes, in the sense that foreign aid is not as much supported as global policies, for different reasons. One of the reasons is that people want all high-income countries to participate, and people are worried about corruption. So I think the global basic income has some appeal because the money goes directly to poor people and not corrupt government. So I think people are selfish to some extent, but are also interested in solving climate change and alleviating extreme poverty. And most people, what the results show is that most people are willing to lose a few dozens euros per month if we can be sure that these two major challenges would be solved.
Thank you very much, Adrien. So let me go through the Q&A. So I have a first question, anonymous, asking you the question of, if we redistribute incomes, there will be additional emissions coming from the fact that this redistribution will generate revenues of people who will consume more and emit more. That's my understanding of the question. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, it's a classical question, and no, it's a misconception, because there is a cap on carbon emission at the global level. So by construction, emissions will decrease in line with the target. It's true that emissions will increase with the poorest people, because, I mean, some people who earn $1 a day, suddenly they will earn $3, and these people will consume more and will emit more. And this is a good thing, actually, because these people are in misery right now. But people who have a large carbon footprint, they would be incentivized to reduce their emission. And because there is a stringent cap on emissions, the carbon price will be set by the market up to the point that emissions will decrease in line with the target. Effectively forcing people to change their lifestyle in high-income countries.
Okay, several questions by Raoul Bazou. One on intergenerational equity. Rather than compensating the current poor, why not compensating the future generation, meaning they are the people who will face the most damages from our current lifestyle, and therefore, rather than creating this global fund, you should propose, you should organize a global future generation fund as a right. What do you think about this intergenerational issue?
So I do not claim that the global climate plan is the most fair possible agreement. I would say it's not the most fair for a different reason than Rahul. For me, what would be better than a global climate plan is a plan that ensures a decent living for every human being. And by decent living, I mean perhaps $300 per month. $50 per month is probably not enough to get good education, good healthcare, good food, good shelter, etc. Now, if we put the money into a fund for future generations instead of funding a basic income, then for me it would be worse, because you would not solve misery right now. So, and probably people in the future, I mean, we don't know, but there is a chance that they are richer than people now, people in Congo or in Bangladesh. So it would be better to give money to the poorest people who live now.
There is an anonymous question on the situation in the US. What do you have to say about the relatively lower adherence to your proposal in the US, and what's the international consideration you can think about that?
There are two reasons. First, Americans would lose out more than Europeans because they pollute much more. So I don't know. Perhaps if we tell the Europeans that they would lose out 85 euros per month, maybe the support would decrease to the point of the US. The second reason is that Republicans in the US are against climate policies and are against redistribution much more than the right wing in Europe. So in Europe, we don't have a polarized debate on climate change. And yeah, I mean, what our results show is that Europeans are more universalist. I don't know why precisely, but that's what. And I remember something I forgot to say about Rahul's question. You may have felt weird that I say that the global climate plan is not the fairest option. Why don't we support the fairest option? Because at Global Redistribution Advocates, we only advocate for policy that are supported by a majority of people. And unfortunately, I haven't tested in survey whether people would be in favor of even more ambitious, even more redistributive policies. And there is a consensus for the equal per capita, not for the historical responsibility approach.
Okay, and there are many questions by Jacques Delclas. I will ask him in a minute to intervene at the mic. Before that, there is a clarification question. I think you mentioned that the permit will have to be purchased by corporation. Do you mean that consumers will not have to cover their own emissions? What's the issue here? Why? I mean, because a large fraction of the emission come from the consumers, not from the producers. When you use your car, when you heat your apartment, that's your own emission. Who will have to pay for that?
Of course, I would say that even all emissions are due to consumers, because if people stopped to consume, then there would be no emission. But the system is the same as the European system, for example. The idea is that you can, I mean, there is a supply chain. The oil, you have to extract the oil to refine it, then it goes to the power plant, and then you enjoy your boiler in your room that has burned some coal to heat your pasta. So either we can tax people who use their boiler, or we can use the firms that refine the oil. And you see that it's much more practical to tax or to price at the stage of the refinery or the extraction, rather than at the point of use where people fill their tank, etc. This is why all emission trading systems in the world have adopted what we call the upstream approach, not the downstream approach. But economically, it's the same, because these firms who have to purchase carbon permits, they will increase their costs to not lose money. And the cost will be passed on consumers. So effectively, it's the consumers who pay.
Thank you, Adrien. Jacques, are you with us? You have so many questions, it's hard to cover them. So Jacques is quite pessimistic about the realism of your proposal. And so Jacques, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
First of all, I am all in favor of very strong and efficient policies in the world for decarbonization. And also I'm very sympathetic to the idea of helping poor countries. Let's first use free trade. Then I strongly disagree with about everything on principles. First thing is the Timbergen rule. you should use one tool for one objective, target. Here, we don't know if the target is reducing carbonization or reducing world poverty. Second, which is probably even worse, I think the proposal is a completely undemocratic by far. First, in most liberal democracies, you cannot commit future taxes and future revenues. That's simply, it's a no-go for most European countries. For what I understand of the proposal, there would be an automatic rule of setting that fiscal revenues from the carbon tax would go to this basic income. That goes massively against all constitutions, tradition. You cannot commit. Otherwise, all the worst lobbies will ask for their for taxes on their sector to be spent on their sector, and at the beginning of the end. Second, I mean, budget laws are annual. You cannot say today that you pre-commit fiscal revenues and fiscal taxes. I mean, that's just not possible. Even in theory, in an ideal world, that is not possible. Then I don't know. I don't understand how. Who would vote for that? All international treaty forbids pre-committing future taxes. At the end of the day, the taxpayer is represented by MPs. And even if there were a global democratic assembly, even let's assume that France is 1% of the population in the world, the EU is 8%. So we would be in an assembly where China, a very non-democratic country, would get 17.5% of MPs. You would have all poor countries with much larger share of MPs than the European Union. And then, of course, all the poor countries would vote for taxing as much as possible rich countries. And of course, knowing that, I don't see why rich countries would enter this kind of democratic assembly. I mean,
thank you, Jacques.
Turkeys do not vote for Christmas.
Adrien, could you answer to this?
Yes, on the legal aspect, I think it's simply wrong. There are various examples of targeted taxes. It's just a principle of public finance to not target taxes, but it's not a legal principle. On the Democratic Assembly, it's not part of the Global Climate Plan. It's a separate proposal. The Global Climate Plan would be established by an international treaty. And we propose that the voting rights of a country on matter concerning the emissions trading system would be proportional to their CO2 emission. And the Democratic Assembly that we propose would have only a consultative role. So it would draft treaties on climate change, would not have the power to enforce it. And actually, I think it would be a great thing if high-income countries would be outvoted by more numerous low-income countries in order to have more massive transfers at the global scale. But I agree with you, this is not at the horizon, and it's not what we propose in the Global Climate Plan.
Okay, thank you, Adrien. There is not a question, but a common positive comment from Caroline Fischer. So maybe she could intervene using the question by Raoul Mazou about the possibility to reallocate intertemporally a national cap. So the question is the following: is it mandatory for low emission countries to auction the allocation of the carbon cap? Can they decide to keep the cap for their future use, for their own use in the future? Sorry.
So that's the kind of technicalities for which we are open to suggestions. And if some of you have ideas, I encourage you to join the scientific committee. But with what we proposed, it's not a country that auction the emissions permit, it's a global entity. We propose that it's managed by ECOSOC at the UN, but it could be a new entity. And so no, a country could not delay the auctioning of its permits. A related question is, should we allow borrowing and banking of emissions permits? I'm not a specialist enough to answer that question. I would tend to say forbid borrowing and put conditions to banking. But yeah, this needs to be addressed. Yeah.
Thank you, Adrien. Caroline, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for letting me intervene, and thanks for a very interesting presentation. I was wondering, so a per capita, a redistribution of global carbon tax revenues on a per capita basis to country governments is, very different than guaranteeing a universal basic income. And so I'm wondering if you looked at the revenues that would be needed to just guarantee that income. So basically you're topping up people who are, poorer than the minimum income without, giving transfers to people who earning above that. And so, restricting to something that more akin to an actual basic income could, allow for a higher basic income and also, avoid the kinds of transfers from poor people in rich countries to rich people in poor countries, and free up more of the revenues to other, other purposes, including funding, mitigation, adaptation, and other activities. So I'm wondering if you sort of evaluated the different revenue and international redistribution needs.
So to be sure that I've understood, do you suggest to not have an equal per capita allocation, but to target poor people?
Exactly. So targeted transfers to ensure a minimum income rather than an equal per capita transfer. Yeah.
I mean, you could propose that instead, but we haven't tested that in the survey. We don't know if people would support it as much. And if I understand correctly, then people in high-income countries would not receive any transfer, and then they would lose much more from the policy that they currently do in our proposal.
Well, that's assuming that you use all of the revenues for that. So if you sort of limit the, another option would be to limit the redistribution to what is necessary to guarantee a minimum income. And then you can also think about how to allocate revenues domestically versus internationally for the remainder.
Yeah, but I mean, in what we propose, 80% of the revenue is spent on the countries where it's collected. So if you want, it goes through an international institution in between, but it goes back to the country. And I think it's much more practical to do it that way, because we tax firms, I mean, we regulate firm upstream. And then we give the same check to everyone. So it's very simple to do. It would be more difficult to compute the carbon footprints of people, to compute the carbon footprint of countries, to then devise which share should be allocated to each countries, etc. So that
I think you would need to price everyone's emissions and then know who are the people who are the poor people in need of transfers. You wouldn't need to calculate carbon footprints.
Okay, so the emissions trading system is the same. So it's just another allocation of the revenues. But then you don't target poor people in the global scale. You target poor people in each country.
No, on the global scale.
Well, then Americans would receive zero basically.
Sorry?
Then Americans would basically receive zero.
Well, some poor Americans would receive something, but most would receive
some
zero. But they also you wouldn't need to ask all of the emission revenues to be going into an international pot.
Yeah, but I don't see that. I mean, then you separate. So part of the revenues is spent domestically, and you don't say how, and part of it is distributed to low-income countries. I mean, I don't know what to want to achieve with that, because if I don't know, for me it's not as clear cut than what we propose, and I think there is value in simplicity. And we also ensure a minimum income, because here we ensure a minimum income at the value of the basic income, which is already a big jump for the poorest humans.
Okay, my friends, it's 2 minutes before the end, so there are still many questions unanswered in the chat, in the Q&A. But I'm sorry, we have to put an end to the conversation. This is a thought-provocative presentation. Thank you very much, Adrien. I think there are still different issues to explore, but indeed that's something promising. I mean, we really, if we could combine fighting climate change and fighting worldwide inequalities, that would be a double success, which is clearly not marginal given the intensity of these two challenges. So I agree with Jacques. There are different issues that make the proposal quite problematic, but other proposals are much more problematic either. So that's not a reason to abandon the idea. Far from that, in fact. So good luck with the proposal. I think you got some support from the participant today. We got almost 100 participants, and it's a demonstration of the interest for trying to find solution on those issues. Thank you all. Thank you, Adrien, and see you next time for the 14th CEPREAERE webinar on climate policies. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.